And the louder now, whatever president you have, will shout women's rights in the Middle East, the more conservative backlash against women's rights you will have in the Middle East or anywhere in the world.
Half Iraqi, half German, Nadia Al-Ali learned Arabic as a scholar in Cairo before obtaining a doctorate at the University of London, where she is currently a professor of gender studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies. She is the author of numerous books about the tension between feminism and cultural sovereignty in the Middle East. Here, she addresses an audience at San Diego State University, California.
Now, although we could have pointed, unfortunately, we could have pointed to several wars and conflicts in the region, but most of the contributions in our book actually focus on the two countries with the longest series of wars and conflict in the Middle East. That is occupied Palestine, the occupied Palestinian territories, and Iraq. So for the remainder of my talk, I would like to share with you some of the main findings in the book. And although I'll draw on examples from both Palestine and Iraq, my main focus will be on Iraq. Now, the chapters in our book all discuss different types of transnational interventions by different actors in the context of Palestine and Iraq. The outcome of these interventions is for the most part not positive. So, for instance, these are the European Mediterranean Partnership. There are several sort of European but also American and British organizations, but we also looked, of course, at the American and British military presence in the region. Now, the outcome of these interventions is for the most part not positive with regards to ensuring women's rights and enabling women's involvement in post-conflict reconstruction processes. And we're actually, one of the things that we come up is that we cannot, in the context of both Iraq and Palestine, we cannot really speak about post-conflict. It's still very much acute conflict. Now, many initiatives like the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership has been slow to mainstream gender into sectors beyond the economic and social spheres. At their most dangerous, transnational interventions empower actors and strengthen structures that actually undermine women's empowerment and women's rights, largely due to strategic security concern. Now, in the Iraqi context, for example, we see that the American and British invasion and occupation of Iraq has weakened the central state, has strengthened ethnic and sectarian leaders, and opened the way for the growth of the informalization of the economy and increasing inequality with regards to gender roles and relations. This has led to a reversal in women's citizenship rights and a de facto deterioration in women's situation. Simultaneously, US funding of women's NGOs threatens to fragment and weaken the women's movement at a time in which women's collective agency for the sake of protecting their rights is more critical than ever. And here I should say that often when I give a talk here, then there's someone in the audience who tells me, but we gave Iraqi women the women's quota. Well, it is true that since 2003 there is a quota enshrined in the Constitution, but I should stress that it's despite US opposition. I mean US opposition, I mean the opposition of the Coalition of Provisional Authority, particularly then Ambassador Paul Bremer, who, when he was confronted by a group of 15 Iraqi women's rights activists in spring 2004, who said, you know, we are actually the majority of the Iraqi population and we want to have a share in the new Iraq. We want to have 40% representation in all political bodies, including parliament. He looked at them and he said, we don't do quotas. Which was funny because when it came to actually ethnic and religious representation, the way the Iraqi Governing Council was appointed by the Americans, it was all about the quota. When I say the Americans, I mean the American government at the time. Okay? But Iraqi women's rights activists were not didn't take this as the no as an answer, and they kept campaigning. And there was actually lots of sort of transnational support. And I think that is one instance of a successful transnational feminist intervention, which then led to a 25% quota being enshrined into the Iraqi constitution. So I think that was sort of a successful instance of Iraqi women activists being involved, making a positive contribution to political process. So what I'm trying to say here is that from the very beginning, you had Iraqi women's rights activists who, despite the rhetoric of women's liberation, knew that women's rights was not going to be presented on them on a platter, but that they had to fight for it. So these pictures of women demonstrating on the street, having sit-ins, campaigning, were very frequent in 2003 and 2004. It became much more difficult from 2005 onwards because of the violence. In the Palestinian case, we see that the ongoing Israeli occupation and international pressure for the Palestinian Authority to meet Israeli security demands severely limit the Palestinian Authority's administrative capacity to establish institutions that may guarantee women's rights, human rights, and the rule of law, as well as reinforcing the significance of kin-based structures that marginalize women. It should come as no surprise that Palestinian women's grassroots activism is concerned to resist Israeli occupation, the main source of their deteriorating situation, rather than engage in building bridges with Israeli women activists on the basis of shared gender interests. And I know that is really very sort of difficult for many women's rights activists and feminists in the West. We are very sort of anti-nationalist, but to realize that it's very difficult to work on a platform of shared gender interests if you don't address the issue of the occupation. In a context in which gender is instrumentalized by those actors who are implicated in war and occupation, and where the international promotion of gender mainstreaming may intensify rather than improve gender inequalities, what role can feminist and women's solidarity movements play? What I mean here is, when President Bush was in power and he was talking about women's rights in Iraq, that created a backlash against women's rights in Iraq. And the louder now, whatever president you have will shout women's rights in the Middle East, the more conservative backlash against women's rights you will have in the Middle East or anywhere in the world, because of the perception that this is imposed from outside, this is an imperialist agenda, despite the fact that, of course, in countries like Iraq, as I showed you, you have many decades of women's rights activism. I mean, since the turn of the 20th century, Iraqi women have been involved in women's rights activism. Since the 40s and 50s, they have played a very active role. They have been educated. They have been in the labor force. But when it becomes a point to show you have to bring civilization, we have to liberate, we have to bring democracy and human rights, in a context where you invade a country, you have actually a knee-jerk reaction against it. And that is unfortunately happening now in many countries in the Middle East, including Iraq and Palestine. But the question then is, for those of us who are based in San Diego, in London, anywhere in the world, who are concerned with women's rights, what can we do? Do we have to shut up? I mean, that was what I was trying to explain to you with the group that I belong to, Act Together in London. We were very hesitant to get involved in the campaign around the Constitution, because we're worried if we do that, being based in London, maybe we're actually not helping women in Iraq. Actually, we might make it worse. And so we waited for many Iraqi women's organizations to tell us, no, but we need your support. We need solidarity from abroad. But that is the dilemma. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't do anything, but I'm suggesting that you have to be very careful, those of us who are concerned with women's rights, when to get involved and how. Now, I think that it is analytically there is what we call sort of transnational feminist organizations. And I think here that it's necessary to analytically differentiate between those transnational feminist networks and campaigns that are transnational in method, meaning networks that actually work across borders and nation states in terms of membership, in terms of networking, communication, using the internet as a means, lobbying, but who are not necessarily rooted in post-colonial, anti-imperialist and global justice approaches. In other words, certain feminist organizations who are transnational in their method are not necessarily transnational in their politics, working with neo-colonial, capitalist and militaristic government agendas. And I'm sort of acutely aware that when I say this in sort of Britain in many contexts, it's sort of, people go along with it, but I'm very acutely aware that I'm saying this in a context where you think that I'm totally weird, okay? But I still go on. So the image that I'm showing you here is, of course, an image of Hillary Clinton with Eleanor Smeal, the president of the feminist majority, which to my mind and many of my friends is an example of what I would call an imperialist feminist who makes a claim for women's rights, but by promoting actually the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, in the name of promoting women's rights. My argument being that actually in not only did neither the invasion of Afghanistan nor the invasion of Iraq promote or empowered women, but it actually did the opposite. But also Iraqi women's rights activists were involved. Some of the staunchest supporters of the US-led invasion were actually Iraqi diaspora women. And here it was very interesting for me, I mean, as someone who since the 90s had been trying to raise awareness about the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, and no one ever paid attention to us. We tried to raise awareness about the Anfal campaign, the gassing of the Kurds in the 80s, of human rights abuses by Saddam Hussein, and no one ever listened to us. But all of a sudden, 2002, both the American government and the British government was very interested in speaking to Iraqi women who could speak about human rights abuses, and they actually funded several organizations and gave them money to speak about the terrible regime. But the timing was very odd. So now, without doubt, some transnational feminist organizations, campaigns and networks reproduce certain structural inequalities. But on the other hand, there are also some transnational feminist organizations that actually do pay attention to intersections of gender, race, class, nationality, and other markers of inequality and injustice. And this is one example of a group that exists all over the world. It's big in the US, it's big in Europe. It's actually started in Israel by a group of Israeli and Palestinian women in black against war, who are feminists, they're peace activists, but they are really looking, they're also anti-racist, and obviously sort of their politics differ very much also in which context you look at. But I would say this is one example of a transnational feminist group that really pays attention to various forms of inequality. And then there's also, I would say that ACT Together, the group that I belong to, and several other Iraqi women activists. For instance, the Iraqi Women's League, I showed you a picture of them marching through Baghdad in 1963. They still exist, they're still active, now again active in Iraq. And also the Organization for Women's Freedom. There are several organizations inside Iraq. Now, a transnational feminist politics which involves an intersectional analysis is in reality, in everyday life, however, often very difficult and requires painful decisions and turmoil. The tension between the need to address women's rights and fight racism, particularly acute in the context of the Middle East and the so-called Muslim world, is very difficult. And I give you one example. Speaking to Western audiences, whether it's Britain or Germany or in the States, when I give a talk about Iraq, I'm always in a dilemma whether I should mention the issue of honor killings. You know, honor killings, or so-called honor killings, refer to the killings of women, mainly, who are accused of being involved in illicit relationships, sexual relationships outside of marriage. Okay, fact is that these have been on the increase. They have been on the increase in the north of Iraq. They are also on the increase in the rest of Iraq. And I know that I've been in situations where I've given a talk for 45 minutes. I thought a very nuanced talk. And some people went away with the only message they got away from my whole talk, which is Iraqi fathers kill their daughters. Okay? I mentioned one example. So my dilemma then is, what is more important? Is it important to speak about the abuse of women's rights, or is it more important to fight against the racism and Islamophobia? It's a difficult one. It's a very difficult one. And those of us who are working in the context of the Middle East and Muslim societies are actually confronting this all the time. But let me move on to another complication. Now, the involvement of diasporas in transnational networks with regard to countries in conflict raises a number of difficult issues with regard to transnational politics. This picture does not actually correspond to what I'm saying right now, okay? I'm going to explain in a moment. On the one hand, diaspora activists may provide important bridges between activists in the north and those in the south. They might be able to mobilize necessary resources and send back to their countries of origin in order to contribute to the rebuilding of their countries. On the other hand, the desire of diaspora activists to participate in the nation from outside through involvement in international political advocacy as well as social welfare and development projects within their country of origin may be perceived as an attempt to capitalize on their diasporic positions, to create new hierarchies of power within their countries of origin. And this happened both in the context of Palestine and Iraq, where people who were outside, who had been in exile, who had been refugees, came back, and then I know for a fact in the Iraqi context, many came back after 2003. I mean, I know, I interviewed here women from San Diego who after 2003 said, okay, we're going back now and we're going to help to rebuild the country. Lots of goodwill, lots of good intention, but unfortunately also quite a bit of patronizing attitude. And so many people inside Iraq actually didn't like it and said, who are these people who were outside for 30 years and are now telling us what to do, how to build democracy, how to engage in women's rights activism. There are a few who managed to stay and to gain respect and credibility, but many actually left after a few years because they didn't feel welcome. And they told me, I don't like their mentality and they did not appreciate me. But when I spoke to Iraqi women who had always lived inside, they were complaining about these women from outside who thought that they knew it all. So this is another complication. Now, women from the diaspora are often very vulnerable to feelings of resentment or active discrediting on the part of local actors. As women, they may be seen as instruments of foreign powers, double agents, or traitors of their authentic cultural roots. Not unsurprisingly, and largely due to the deteriorating security situation, women's activism in Iraq has been extremely challenging. As middle-class professionals and foreign passport holders have been key targets of frequent kidnappings for ransom, as well as targeted assassinations by militias seeking to impose traditional gender roles, or insurgents punishing those with any connections to the US and its allies, Iraqi women returnees have been particularly vulnerable. Now, I just want to say something about tradition, because one of the things that I have been trying to write against in my work is sort of the idea that you can explain things away by reference to Iraqi culture, Islamic culture, Middle East culture. And what I've been trying to do, especially in my history, is to show that it's not so much about... Sorry about that. Rather than religion or culture, it's changing political and economic conditions that have actually changed women's situation. And when I show this picture, I know that many people who don't know much about Iraq say, oh, this is very traditional or very they're going back. But when I show it actually to Iraqis, especially older Iraqis, they say, this is not Iraq, this never existed in Iraq before. This, which is, by the way, not very common, but this is a post-2003 phenomenon. It never existed in Iraq before. And these are women who are linked to the Shia Islamist cleric Muqtada as-Sadr. You might have heard of Muqtada as-Sadr, the Sadrist movement. And it's a political Islamic extremist movement. And this kind of dress code has never existed in Iraq before. So this is actually a very modern phenomenon. It's a post-invasion phenomenon. And same here. Again, you know, in Iraqi tradition, traditionally Iraqi women are wearing what is called an abaya, which is sort of a black cloth that was sort of worn above the clothes, but not covering the face. And actually since the 50s and 60s, no, more the 60s, especially in urban areas, women did not wear it. And it's only again since the 90s, since the sanctions period, that many Iraqi women started to sort of wear hijab, wear headscarf, but not this. I mean, this is a very new phenomenon. Just to say a little bit about Palestine, the one contribution in the book by Sophie Richter-Devro, who recently finished her PhD, which is about to publish, which was on Palestinian women's rights activism. And she quite controversially argued in her chapter that a transnational feminism in the context of Palestine needs to actually support women's struggle for self-determination if it has to have any relevance for women there. And here she also speaks about, you know, in feminist theory, we have sort of moved away from a kind of essentialist women as essentially peaceful or women as essentially mothers. But she's actually pointing to the way Palestinian women very much use motherhood as a way to peacefully resist the occupation. I mean, they're very much involved in non-violent activism. But let me come to a conclusion here so that you have some time to ask me some questions as well. Now, the complex and vexed relationship between gender and transnationalism in the context of war and conflict, international peace initiatives, political transition, development programs, and diaspora mobilization is closely linked to the vexed relationship between gender and nationalism. The question whether nationalism and feminism are compatible or mutually exclusive has been a source of contestations and tensions amongst feminist scholars. What emerges in the context of recent feminist scholarship on Palestine and Iraq is that we need to pay careful attention to the specific historical context and current constellation of political and social forces when we analyze a particular nationalism. First of all, we have to distinguish between different forms of nationalism, whether exclusive, expansive, driven by xenophobia and racism, or those related to liberation struggles. But we also have to carefully examine the specific form and underlying ideology of resistance movements in the context of invasions, imperialist encroachments, and military occupations. In a context where military intervention is a tool of empire building and militarism legitimizes the use of armed forces for this end, the flip side is that armed force is considered a legitimate means of resistance to empire. We see this in Iraq, where resistance to occupation has become almost synonymous with armed resistance. Many groups with different ideological orientations make up the armed resistance, including jihadist Salafi groups, Shia Islamist militia, Ba'athist, loyalist of the former regime, and nationalists. And what is interesting here is that, or ironically, when it comes to women, is those groups linked to the government, militias linked to the government, and those groups actually fighting the government and the occupation are very similar in the way they treat women. I mean, these are mainly sort of extremist Islamist groups, linked to the government or those fighting, when they move into a neighborhood, they try to impose certain dress code on women. There have been attacks on women who are professional, who are involved in civil society organizations. In Basra alone in 2007, 133 women were killed for not being Islamic enough. It had nothing to do with Islam, but it was different groups fighting for territory and using women's bodies. And so what I'm arguing is that just as militarism is embedded within social inequalities and simultaneously helps to reproduce those inequalities, so armed resistance depends upon the mobilization of particular notions of masculinity and femininity, linked to notions of race, ethnicity, religion, class, and the reshaping of gender relations. Even where armed resistance groups adopt progressive ideologies, incorporate women fighters, and address issues of gender equality, experience demonstrates that tensions exist between national liberation and women's liberation. Women's involvement in armed struggle may simply expand notions of women's roles without challenging masculine privilege. In conclusion, I would like to argue that those who are concerned to improve women's rights all over the world are challenged to make the links between various forms of discrimination and oppression, the abuse of rights and gender-specific violence on the one hand, and the abuse of human and civil rights and military interventions in the name of the so-called war on terror on the other hand. We cannot credibly and coherently argue for women's liberation or even the narrower concept of women's rights without simultaneously addressing the wider context entailing a whole array of human and civil rights abuses as well as forms of exclusion. Torture, for example, I would argue, is a feminist issue. Whether it takes place in Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, or local detention centers in the US and the UK, we need to challenge the systematic abuse of civil and human rights and reconceptualize the continuum of violence to include the US and UK-led military interventions in the Middle East and the abuse and oppression inherent within these. However, as I've indicated earlier, I also feel uncomfortable with liberal notions of multiculturalism on the one hand and anti-imperialist glorifications of military resistance on the other hand, which tend to ignore and distort the often devastating impact of armed militias on women's lives. As I've argued over the last years in many different contexts, the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend. Thank you.